everyone. Thank you for being here and thank you for joining us. My name's Joanne Sivanathan and I am a senior consultant here at Turner & Townsend. And today we will be joined by Kate Watson, who is also from Turner & Townsend. So this is a social housing retrofit accelerator event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero and delivered by Turner & Townsend. With that, thank you for joining, and I will now hand over to Kate to start off the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne, and welcome everybody. So today we're going to have a look at the role of a retrofit coordinator. And I think this is quite an important one to understand when you're looking at developing a project for delivery under one of the government funded schemes. It's also useful to know, if you were using eco funding at all, that a retrofit coordinator has a role in that funding as well. So any funding that comes from the government requires the use of PAS 2035, and the role of the retrofit coordinator is part and parcel of that process. So let's move on. The agenda today, we're going to have a look at PAS 2035, key themes around PAS. We'll have a look at the role of a retrofit coordinator, and then we'll have a look at the various roles in the project. So moving on. Okay, great. So I will try and go over some of the understanding of PAS 2035 and why it's there. So we'll have a look at PAS 2035. So before we move on to the next slide, just for everybody's information that hasn't got that history to it, the reason PAS 2035 came into being is because there was some pretty poor installation activity that was being delivered under various funding programs, a lot of it under the CESP program, some of it under ECO, and some of it under the Green Deal communities. So one of the big projects that has came to light was a project up near Blackpool in Flitwick and Fishwick. Sorry, I get the two middled up ones in Hertfordshire, Bedfordshire. And there was a catalogue of errors that came out of that project that resulted in some very bad quality external wall insulation being installed, which has led to issues with houses, so damp, mould, various other things, ill health, a lot of stress for residents, and the council was left with a bill to rectify it as a result of that, and that really shouldn't happen. That's the worst case example in a bigger project, but there are multiple other examples that have happened around the country. We often use EWI as an example of where it can go wrong, because it's quite a complex approach. But there are other things where installs where it's not been done well, particularly in the past. So, for example, you can have poorly installed loft insulation or inappropriate cavity wall insulation for the location that it's in. So a review was done, and that was the Bonfield review, and it was called Each Home Counts. And it looked into the whole retrofit sector and made some recommendations. And one of the recommendations that came out of that was PAS 2035. So it is quite important to understand that PAS 2035 is there to drive best practice in the sector, to ensure that government funding, particularly, so it's taxpayers' money, but actually organisational funding is spent on the right type of work for the right property, and we get a good outcome. So it leaves the property in a good position, it reduces energy demand and makes the home warmer and cheaper to heat for the residents. And in doing so, we also achieve carbon emission savings, which is also part of why we do this type of work. So that's a very quick potted history about PAS 2035 and how it came to be for anybody that didn't know about it previously. So I'll move on to the next slide. So there are essentially 6 stages to the PAS delivery process. The first stage is intended outcomes. So here we want to understand is, what do we want to achieve with our project? What are our intended outcomes? So in SHDF, we've had various intended outcomes. So they could be an EPCC as a result of the work that we've done, or it could be aiming for that kilowatt hours per year heating demand. So it was 90 under wave 2.1 and 2.2, trying to achieve 90 kilowatts per meter squared, 90 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year heating demand. So that could be one of your metrics. So there are different metrics that you can take, but it is, so if you're doing a government funded scheme, you would want to try and achieve the metrics that the government policy sets out. You are doing a different approach, and you might want to set your own metrics, whatever they would be, but that's what you want to try and achieve. So part of that intended outcome under a lot of government policies to ensure that residents aren't paying more for their heating as a result of the work that we do. So sometimes there's a, to get to an EPCC, we can choose a route where we put solar PV on, but it might not reduce, it'll get us over to an EPCC, but it may not reduce the heating demand. And there may be other activities that we could have done that would help reduce the heating demand and the bill cost to the resident. So there are a number of different intended outcomes. So that's the first point of your project to understand under PAS. The next stage is to understand the risk assessment, and I'll come on to this in a bit more detail further on. There has been a simplification in the risk assessment as a result of transitioning from PAS 2035 to 2019 version to the PAS 2023 version. This gets really confusing to say out loud, 2020, 30 and all of that stuff. So I'll go through that really slowly, and I'm sorry if I'm labouring things, but it's to make sure it makes sense. So you do a risk assessment to understand what the risks are by doing different retrofit approaches, retrofit installations on that property before we go forward with anything else. We then do a dwelling assessment. So this is around a retrofit assessment. It's a little bit more than a domestic energy assessment or an EPC, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail as we move through. And then there's a planning and design stage. And in the planning and design stage, there's the role of the retrofit coordinator really comes into their own. They are involved in all of these stages, by the way, but they really come into their own in the planning and design stage. Well, they'll look at all the information that's been collected, they'll look at the intended outcomes, and they'll make a proposal about how you could improve those properties to achieve the intended outcomes and what are the best measures of approach to take forward. We then have the installation and handover phase. And then finally, we have the monitoring and evaluation. And this is, again, a really key stage in the role of the retrofit coordinator within the PAS. So let's move on to the next slide. I've got an errant X here, so I apologise. Ignore the big red X across here. I was trying to resolve this before we got online, and unfortunately it was not done in time. But there are essentially 6 roles in PAS 2035. There is a role of a retrofit advisor. You can do a level 3 energy awareness qualification, which will give you a very good grounding on retrofits generally. And it would be a really useful skill, I would say, for any resident liaison officer, tenant liaison officer, potentially for anybody on a customer service line. So anybody that might need to understand a little bit about energy efficiency, but isn't there to give detailed advice. We've talked about the retrofit coordinator being an encompassing role under PAS, and that's because you really should engage them right at the beginning of your project. So as we said in the last slide, when we start looking at those intended outcomes, we want to then engage with our retrofit coordinator and say, these are the intended outcomes that we want. This might be our long list of properties. We'd like you to support us to understand what's the best approach for us to take here. The retrofit assessor will do that dwelling assessment so that you get a good understanding about each and every dwelling. You may not do a dwelling assessment for every single property at an early stage of your project. You may want to look at the archetypes that you have in your property portfolio or in your potential list of properties. So you might have, we'll use a really basic example, but you might have an estate of, let's say, 200 properties, but there's actually 4 different housing types on that estate. So you might have 4 different archetypes. And at an early stage, to understand your project better, you might just do a retrofit assessment on 4 different properties and use those to understand generically how you could improve the rest of the properties on that estate. Now, I'll caution that because you do need to do a retrofit assessment for every single property before you can deliver it. And you do need to have pretty good understanding of your data as an organisation and know it's up to date on all your systems, because sometimes we have information on a property and we get an EPC or we get that retrofit assessment and it comes back with some data. But actually what's happened is somebody else in the heating team, in the M&E team, has gone out and replaced some boilers, and you've not had a retrofit assessment on one of those properties. So they may have a different EPC rating to the one that you've done for your modelling. So you just need to be really cautious that when we do archetype EPC assessment, dwelling assessments, that it may not be appropriate for every single property in a similar archetype on that estate, and that you do need to do one when you go through to delivery. Okay, so we have that retrofit assessor role. We also have a retrofit designer. Your retrofit designer would come on after you've had a retrofit assessment and an initial review by your retrofit coordinator to understand the risks attached to what you are proposing to do and whether there is a specific role for certain different retrofit designers. Now, there are some very clear details within the PAS about who a retrofit designer is and the qualifications required. For some sort of fairly simple measures that are individual measures you might install, the contractor might be a retrofit designer. As you increase the risk attached to doing multiple measures or more risky measures generally, so things like internal or external wall insulation, maybe underfloor insulation, you may need to employ a retrofit designer that has the specific qualifications to get involved. They would go through and come up with a proposal. You may need to go through planning and they would help you through that planning phase. And once you've got that approved, it's the role of the retrofit installer. Your retrofit installer needs to be PAS 2030 accredited, also up to the new 2023 version will come into play next April 2025. So any projects that you deliver this year, absolutely fine. But as from the next financial year, you need to stack up to the 2023 version of both the install and the process PAS. Finally, in this process, you've got the retrofit evaluator. So this is the person that evaluates whether the projects have been a success at the end of it. And they do that through a monitoring and evaluation process. And we will come on to have a look at that in a bit more detail. A lot of monitoring and evaluation is taken on board by retrofit coordinators. And therefore, it's quite important that we think about this at the front end of our project so that we are making sure that when we are procuring a retrofit coordinator, this is part of their role and they are aware of that. And actually, at the beginning of the customer journey, of the whole journey, the retrofit journey, we're thinking about what does the monitoring and evaluation process look like? Okay, the next slide. So in this slide here, some of you may have seen this before. In the old PAS or the current PAS that runs out in March next year, PAS 2019 version, we had 3 risk pathways. Risk pathway A, and different people could do different roles compared to risk pathway A and risk pathway C. In the new PAS, the risk pathways have been simplified, so there is only going to be a risk pathway B. There are still other risks to take on board, but I think we can look at that in a little bit more detail as we move through here. But I think it's very clear there are very clear roles for assessor with the right qualifications, and looking at the strategy and the design, and then the installation and the evaluation at the end. So there are very clear roles who can do that within your PAS structure. Okay, so let's have a look at retrofit coordinators generally. So in the PAS, it says that a retrofit coordinator is a person qualified with specialist retrofit project management skills. They take overall responsibility for the assessment of dwellings, the identification, specification, evaluation of energy efficiency measures for installation at a given dwelling as a single project. So there are some key words here. They take overall responsibility. That is why they need to be included at the inception of your project to understand the project outcomes, to have a look at the risks attached to them, to be involved with the outcomes of any dwelling assessment, to work hand in hand with a designer if necessary, and to support with looking at the proposals that your contractor may put forward as a solution to the measures that you want to do. And then at the end, in the handover and the monitoring and evaluation process. Something else that you might want to note here is also that the installation at a given dwelling as a single project. So that does not say this is for multiple dwellings as a single project. It means every single dwelling has to have this in their place. So let's go back to that example I gave earlier with you could look when you're at project inception, doing archetype dwelling assessments. You could do an archetype retrofit coordination at that early phase. But once you move into a real delivery on site type of activity, you absolutely need to have a dwelling assessment for every property, and you have to have a retrofit coordination for every property. So you may have two properties that look identical, but they won't be, because you might have a couple of semi-detached properties. They have slightly different orientation. They will get the sun in different places at different times because of the location of where they are. You may have two different family setups within it. They will use their house differently. So they still need to be assessed differently because they do operate differently, even if they look from the outside and the inside, to all intents and purposes, the same layout, just in reverse. So I think it's just really important to understand that, this retrofit coordination role is not there as an overseeing at a high level. When I did say that you could do a sort of archetype at a very early inception, I actually would say the earlier you have any dwelling assessments and the detail on retrofit coordination, the better your understanding of your properties will be, and it will be easier to design and take forward. I know there is a cost attached to that, and until you get funding, lots of people don't want to spend that money. But there is a risk that if you don't have that level of detail and you start delivery, you will find out that there were things that you didn't know about if you've done a kind of high level archetype-based activity. Right. Different types of coordinator. They're all retrofit coordinators, essentially, but where they sit within your organisation or externally could have an impact as to the type of work that they would do, the quality, their engagement in the process. So let's start off on the right-hand side. The right-hand side is a retrofit coordinator that says they can sign off any project. If you have a retrofit coordinator that comes to you and says they can sign off any project that they've not been involved with since the beginning of the project, or haven't been brought on board as a replacement perhaps for another retrofit coordinator, and therefore would have seen all of that information, they're not compliant to the PAS, and so you shouldn't work with them. Okay, they don't know what's been agreed, and you are likely to have poor outcomes if you go down that route. So on this diagram, we have a client employed coordinator at one end, and we have an employed retrofit coordinator by an installer at the other end. And as you move from left to right on the screen, you have an increased conflict of interest. So where you have an internal client-employed retrofit coordinator, they work for your organisation. They should have your organisation's best interests at heart and want to have the best outcomes for the organisation and the clients you support, your residents. As you move across to the right of the screen, you lose a level of control. Now, that's not to say that that's a bad thing, but it's just to understand how that concept changes as you work with different types of coordinators. So you could work with an independent coordinator. There are quite a few companies out there that do retrofit assessments and retrofit coordination, and some even do design as well. And that's all they do. That's their main business. Some of them might be building surveyors as well, but you know, they're an independent organisation and that's their core activity. If you employ them direct, then you give them a specification of what you want them to do and where you want them to support you, and they are working for you. They're not working for the contractor, they're working for you. They're there to represent you. You could employ a retrofit coordinator through a managing agent. A managing agent may have responsibility for lead generation with residents. If you are working on a local authority scheme, you're not a housing provider. They may have a responsibility for manage a bunch of contractors for you. So if they're also managing a retrofit assessment and retrofit coordinator, you know, there is a beginning of blurred lines about pushing projects through that might not be ideal for certain activity because it'll help with that lead generation, or you can give work to one of your subcontractors. So you're beginning to sort of see there could be a conflict of interest here. And we also have retrofit coordinators that could be installed by an installer. Now, I want to just say very clearly, retrofit coordinators that are employed by an installer are not necessarily going to do a bad job for you. There's some very good retrofit coordinators. There's some very good contractors out there who have the best interests at heart of everything they do. However, depending on what your contractor may do as their core business, it may not well align with what is best for the property to improve it. And there you start to have a conflict as to whether your retrofit coordinator is specifying measures to be installed because it works for the installer and it helps them generate an income, or whether it's best for the property and the outcomes that you've put in place to get at the end of the project. So it's just a case of understanding that conflict of interest sliding scale and where you sit on it and how you manage that process. Okay, coordinator costs. Now I know that coordinator costs have gone up. Partly that's through inflation, as we know. Partly it's also demand, and there haven't been enough coordinators out in the market. There is also this transition now to PAS 2035-2023, which clearly states there is a need to inspect installations. So that now requires a site visit to do inspections. There was an implication under PAS 2035-2019 that site inspections would happen, but it wasn't clearly stated, and a lot of site visits didn't happen. Now, I'm not sure how you inspect the quality of an installation without visiting site and having a look at it. If somebody's got a good idea how you can do that otherwise, I'd really like to know, because there's only so much you can really see through a telephone or a tablet. Asking somebody else to point you in that direction, not being able to inspect all areas of the building. You know, you really need to go to site and have a look. So I know that the requirement to go and inspect on site is driving the prices up. But again, how can you guarantee that the quality of the work is up to what it should be and sign off that work without inspecting it. And if you're not getting the quality and it's being signed off, you're not really going to get the outcomes that you put in place. And is it going to be the best way you could spend that money? So let's say it's an extra £500 on the cost of your retrofit coordination, right? But you're not going to pay £500 per property. If you've got, let's say, 10 properties in the same estate that can be inspected on the same day, that's a day's inspection. That's not an extra amount for each and every property. So you need to think about how you can reduce those inspection costs by thinking about how you can lump projects and inspections together. That's part about how you program works. And I know that's not always easy with people that don't want to do works at a certain time and all of that sort of stuff. But you can have a look as to, you know, trying to reduce those additional site costs by going, okay, you can come to site on this day, you're going to inspect these 12 properties. In terms of EWI installation, where it was always quite an interesting one, there were 3 stages of inspection previously under various funding regimes, and I would say they're quite good stages to have. So that would be when you put the insulation on, and then they put the base coat on, and then there's a final inspection when all the works were complete. And they are quite good points to do that inspection, and anybody that's worked as a retrofit coordinator for a while will understand in the business what those inspection points would be. Okay, so let's go back to this slide in a bit more detail. We have different costs, and this goes on a slightly different direction to the last one. So where we have those non-compliant sign-off services, they might be quite cheap. That's because they're not doing the process, it's not compliant, and they're not visiting site, and that's the only reason they can do it really cheaply. So let's ignore those ones because they're not compliant. And then we have various different grades of costs. If we start on the right-hand side, the specialist consultant is going to probably charge you the most money, along with perhaps a chartered professional. So your chartered professional could be a surveyor, it could be an architect, could be any number of person who has the right sort of qualifications in place. Then you've got your internal employee. Now, it's put down there as being more expensive. It probably depends on what you're paying them, to be honest. It depends whether that's their only role or they have another role. So again, that sits with you. An assessor coordinator organisation, perhaps within the managing agent, perhaps on their own, they are going to be probably cheaper than some specialist consultants, architects, that type of thing. And then your installer coordinator is going to probably be cheaper. Now, it's quite well known that sometimes you can have a very cheap price for a coordinator from a contractor as a one-off price, and they could be hiding costs for the coordinator in other activity that you've asked them to price for. So just be aware and be a little bit cute about having a look at those prices that come through. If they're really low from your installer coordinator compared to, let's say, any of those other versions, it could be that some of those costs are being swallowed up in some other costs that are being given to you. Or they may not be doing some of the activity that you would expect from other people. Again, I don't want to put everybody that is an installer coordinator into that category, because not everyone will behave like that. But it's just useful to understand how some people can use the other costs that they're putting forward to hide, to make some other things seem cheaper than they actually are. Okay, so let's move on. The role of the retrofit coordinator in projects. So there's quite a lot of detail here. Okay, so this is going back to our process, and there's the first one is to look at that intended outcomes. And we have gone through that a little bit at the beginning, but so we want to have a look at our preliminary considerations. So is that an internal requirement that we need to achieve? Is it meeting the minimum requirements of the government funding programme? What are our requirements? We want to have a look at engagement advice, how we're going to bring our residents on board, how we're going to identify them, and then looking at our project generally. What do we want to do? Do we want to focus on the worst properties that we've got and bring them all up to a certain level? Are they quite complex? Do we have enough knowledge and experience of delivering this work? Do we want to start with some quick and easy wins? You know, we've got a whole load of houses that need cavity wall and loft insulation. That's relatively easy to do. Should we just do those quite quickly, achieve EPCCs, and then when we've learned something, we can come back and look at some of these more complex things? This is all a business decision. It's a business decision to take with your director, but it's also a consideration to how it will work with the funding requirements. So this is when you look at those intended outcomes and what you're trying to achieve, and whether you look at kind of the different archetypes and all of that type of activity. And so you really want to involve your retrofit coordinator in this process if you can, or you want to at least list out what your priorities are for those intended outcomes so that they are aware of it when you bring them on board. Okay, the risk assessment stage. So there are 5 criteria that you want to sort of consider when looking at dwelling assessments. So that's the number of dwellings in the project, the number of measures per dwelling, the type of measures proposed, the combination of those measures, and then the construction and built form of the properties that you're looking at. And then we've talked about this identified as risk pathway A, B, and C, but as it says below, we're now delivering about everything under pathway B. So that is a standardized risk process. There is another slide where we'll look at these risk pathways. I think it's coming up on the next one, and you'll kind of think, well, hang on, I thought we got rid of those risk pathways, but come back to that. So what are the implications? It's going to help you understand what your project requirements are. You know, what are our risks involved? We've got some construction built form risks that we need to consider, and how we can adapt and propose specific materials or approaches to reduce energy in those built forms. And then also it helps you understand the basic building assessment and how you can use the information to help you model performance and outcomes that you can achieve from the different approaches you use. We use mostly through the use of RDSAP as retrofit assessors. That's normally what they will use when they go around and assess things. That can be converted into a SAP model, which is a little bit more detailed. And you could also use PHPP if you really wanted to achieve good quality outcomes and really low heat demand. So a PHPP, for those that aren't aware, is Passive House Planning Package. This is it's a much more detailed approach certainly to RDSAP and to SAP. It's a slightly different approach. In SAP, you can get to an higher EPC rating by changing your heating system or putting renewables onto your project. It will get you there to an EPC B or maybe an A really quickly. In PHPP, the focus is on looking at the fabric to improve the energy performance of the property before you change the heating or energy producing elements of the property. Okay, let's move on. So risk assessment. Risk pathway B, we've said, doesn't really exist anymore. Sorry, the pathways A and C don't exist anymore. We're moving to a single pathway B. Airtightness testing is no longer normative under this assessment. So it's not to say you don't ever need to do it. It depends on what you're trying to achieve as your outcome as to whether you might want to do an airtightness testing. It depends how your monitoring and evaluation, what it comes back with, as to whether you might want to go back and have a look at it. But it's not a necessary requirement to take things forward. Okay, I'm conscious of time. I've been talking quite slowly, so I'm going to move things forward quite a little bit quicker. In terms of the retrofit design, this is a nice matrix that can help identify what are the risks involved with specifying particular measures on a property. So anywhere you have a green, that's not a problem. There's no high risk. You can interact with that. Normally, where there's a red, they're incompatible, but this might be including things like internal wall insulation and cavity at the same time. On the whole, you would not do cavity wall insulation and a solid wall measured like EWI or IWI. Where there is yellow, there is a connection, and that might mean things like you might want to see how you've done air tightness testing. So, for example, let's say there's a hole that needs to be put through the wall to connect a pipe to a heat pump, and it goes through perhaps some other measure that's been put through there. You might want to consider how that's going to happen and what the interaction would be. Do you need to put a sleeve through for cavity wall insulation? Are there other activities that need to be considered there? And then the orange, there are interactions, and you really need to consider the risks involved with those and the performance impacts that might have on the other measures that they highlight in that section. Okay, so here we've got the dwelling assessment, and this is when we go out to site, we do the retrofit assessment. The retrofit coordinator should commission the retrofit assessor in line with the dwelling risk pathway. Now, we've done away with A and C, so what is the risk pathway here? So the risk pathway here, I would say, is it a heritage building? That is one of them. The other one is it a specific type of building construction, a built system form, a high-rise, that type of activity where you need to have a better understanding of the risks attached compared to, let's say, a standard semi-detached cavity wall construction house. So you might want to have a look at that as a different risk profile and who you want to go out and do that type of dwelling assessment. The retrofit coordinator must sign off that application of getting the retrofit assessor out there. And the retrofit coordinator may carry out that dwelling assessment if they have the right qualifications as a dwelling assessor. So they would need to have the domestic energy assessor qualification and the additional qualification to make themselves a retrofit assessor. Okay, the next bit is, so it's commissioned by the retrofit coordinator. We have a look at the mandatory requirements by the risk path. We've said a lot of this stuff already. So every dwelling must be assessed. You can, the dwelling assessor and the retrofit coordinator, if they are the person that does that, they're not really allowed to give advice to the resident. You could talk about potential things that could be done, but this can be quite misleading because really, until you've had the dwelling assessment reviewed by the retrofit coordinator, and they have given an assessment of what would be appropriate to achieve the intended outcomes, any suggestion might sway with the resident what they think they're going to get as an improvement and what they're happy to accept when they're presented with the proposal. So I'd say it's really important that we don't give false representation or false hope about what people will get before that design process has been taken. Okay, let's move on. Planning and design stage. So at this stage, your retrofit coordinator will conduct an improvement option evaluation, and they will develop a medium-term plan and agree that with the client. A medium-term plan is 25 years. So this is how to get that building from where it is now to, let's say, carbon neutral in 25 years, or to the best position that that house could be in 25 years' time, with future retrofit and improvements in mind to achieve that. And then the other thing that they need to concern themselves with is whether it's an appropriate design for the particular project, the property, and the intended outcomes. Right, we've got an improvement option evaluation here. I will press this button to see if I can make it play. It doesn't have any sound, but it does scroll through, and I don't know how much you can see. So this was a very early spreadsheet-based option evaluation. I suspect a lot of the retrofit coordinators that will work now will use a different system. It will be an online system that they work, but they have a look at kind of, it works with the interaction model, and they normally put in sort of sizes and various different things in here. So it helps you understand what are the best measures. Are there any sequencing issues? I mean, do we want to do stuff that would mean if we came back in 5 years' time to do something else, we'd have to damage the previous install to do the next upgrade? Probably not, because that's going to cost more money. And it might have knock-on effects to any guarantees, warranties, that type of stuff, if you do any changes to it. What you want to get out of this option evaluation is the carbon cost effectiveness of doing the work. So the way the carbon cost effectiveness works essentially is the first thing that you do on a property that's not very energy efficient is likely to be the most carbon cost effective. As you go through that list, they will become less carbon cost effective because you've already made bigger changes. So if you put a gas boiler in before you put in loft insulation in, you'll get a bigger carbon cost effectiveness on the gas boiler than you would on the loft insulation. If you swap that round, you probably get a different outcome. So just bear that in mind. You need to kind of consider more than one approach. One of the other things you can look at is future fuel costs. Obviously, that can only be calculated on the current price of energy, and it will change if energy costs change. So you just need to kind of understand that. And then you can do a payback calculation. So this is to look at how quickly are you going to be able to pay off the cost of doing that installation through bill savings. So this is particularly useful for some customers who are paying for it themselves that want to understand what that looks like. It can be less helpful if you are not occupying the property and have no control of how the occupants use heating in their home, because you can't guarantee that payback. So, but if you take all of those in the round alongside, I would say, other things like disruption level, or also including things like the upgrades that you might want to do. So if you have solar PV, you might need to change an inverter every 5-10 years. If you buy certain ones, it might be every 2 years. So there'll be a cost attached to that. So you take those in the round and you're likely to get a better outcome of what's the best path to take. Okay. I think we've done all of that. So we move on to this one. And then this is this medium-term plan that I talked about. So this is your route to optimal retrofit. So this is the route to net zero, or the route to how you can do, let's say, the best retrofit you can ever do on that property. But it's a 25-year horizon. So we're not going to propose that we necessarily do everything in one go, although we might choose to, particularly if it's very easy to get to that very high EPC rating and achieve everything we can quite quickly. But it is looking at how we would do that over a period of time if we come back in 5 years and then another 5 years and do something else, which can really help with other maintenance programs and managing the cost of retrofit over a period of time. It helps with those different trigger points. So let's say things like other maintenance upgrades that you might be doing. So a classic one to think about is if you're putting a new roof on a property, whether you'd want to put solar PV on at the same time as doing the roof replacement. So there's all those different considerations that you could think about. Yeah, I'm very conscious we've got 10 minutes left for people that might need to drop off. I mean, I'd probably stay a little bit, but let's move on again. The next stage in this process is installation. The main role here is to have oversight for the retrofit coordinator, is to have oversight of the works on site as they're going through. So things like you would have had, your contractor would have had a specification. Now, that sometimes you give them a performance specification and sometimes you give them a very detailed specification of what products you want to use or what materials you want to use. If the contractor came back and said, I can't use that material, I want to use this. Let's say they chose, originally there was a phenolic foam insulation, and then they came back and said, actually, I want to use a mineral fiber, and I don't want to change the thickness, I just want to change the product. Now, a phenolic foam has a better U value than a mineral fiber insulation, so that would impact the performance of the outcome of that work that you were going to do. So the retrofit coordinator needs to know about that, and they would need to flag whether that's going to be an issue. And they might push back to the contractor and go, no, you can't do that because that's a performance impact. And certainly they'd need to let the client know that there might be a change. There could also be a cost change attached to that in terms of the cost of the materials and the cost of the installation. So that's their role as well. A retrofit coordinator needs to be involved with commissioning, or at least check certificates to ensure that they've been commissioned appropriately. They should be involved, they must be involved with handovers. Doesn't mean that they are there to do and lead the handover, but they should be there to witness it, make sure the resident is getting a good understanding of what's been done to their property and how to use any systems that have been installed, and what the impact might be if they, let's say, decided to block a ventilation system that had been installed. So this all ensures that the compliance with PAS 2035 has been achieved. Okay. The final stage here is monitoring and evaluation. So this includes the post-installation survey of the resident to see whether they believe that there have been good outcomes as a result of the works that have happened in the house. Now, they might not know what the intended outcomes were for their property, probably not, but what they want is to know that the works have been made a difference to them. Now, quite often residents are not very happy about the mess and disruption to their lives as a result of having these works done. So sometimes they'll moan about it. Sometimes they have really good cause to moan about it. And sometimes it's just because we don't like having builders in our houses. So it's a good opportunity. But what you really want to understand is are they able to operate the systems? Do they function? Do they have a concern? Are there things that are happening in the house that they think are a bit unusual? Suddenly got this mold patch appeared upstairs in the bedroom and I don't know why it's there. That would trigger a site visit to go and understand why that's happening. So you have this initial monitoring and evaluation, but sometimes it identifies things that aren't going well. And then you might want to bring that retrofit coordinator back to site to inspect the house and have a look to see what's going on. It might be that there's just been a poor finish somewhere. It might be that something's not been commissioned as well as it should be. There could be some more unintended consequences that need to be looked into, and longer term monitoring might need to take place.